My husband's mistress sent me photos of them together at our vacation home. He's upgrading, honey, the message read. I smiled as I forwarded them to my lawyer. At the divorce hearing, my husband paled when he discovered who truly owned the mansion, the cars and the company he thought was his. My signature was on everything and his was nowhere to be found. The notification timed while I was pruning roses in our garden. A simple sound that would forever divide my life into before and after. I wiped my hands on my gardening apron and reached for my phone, expecting a message from Richard about his flight landing safely in Chicago. Instead, I found myself staring at photos of my husband and a woman I didn't recognize, tangled together on the Egyptian cotton sheets I'd personally selected for our Martha's Vineyard vacation home. He's upgrading, honey, read the message beneath the photos. Richard deserves someone who matches his ambition. Don't worry, I'll take good care of everything you thought was yours. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't catch. Instead, a strange calm washed over me as I swiped through 5 intimate photos, each one more damning than the last. In the final image, Richard was smiling directly at the camera, his arm around a young blonde woman who couldn't have been more than 35. They stood on our private deck overlooking the Atlantic, drinking from the vintage crystal flutes my grandmother had given us for our wedding. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey. If you've ever felt underestimated or hidden your true strength, this story might resonate with you. The moment Catherine received those taunting photos marked the beginning of her reclaiming her power. Consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us share more stories of quiet resilience and unexpected triumph. Now, let's discover how a seemingly traditional housewife built her invisible empire right under her husband's nose. I sat down on the garden bench and studied her face. Pretty in that polished corporate way, sharp cheekbones, calculated smile, eyes that evaluated everything as an asset to be acquired. I recognized the type immediately. After all, I'd spent 35 years married to a man cut from the same cloth. Melissa, I presume, I whispered to myself, finally putting a face to the name I'd discovered on hotel receipts and in late-night text messages over the past year. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to remember the day Richard and I met at a charity gala in Boston. I was 23, recently graduated from Wellesley, and he was 28, ambitious and charming in his perfectly tailored suit. He'd pursued me with an intensity that I mistook for genuine love. Now, with the wisdom of hindsight, I recognized it had been my family connections he truly desired, though he'd never discovered the full extent of what I brought to our marriage. On paper, I was Catherine Elizabeth Harrison, devoted wife of Richard Harrison, respected Boston financial executive. I hosted dinner parties for his colleagues, attended charity functions on his arm, and maintained our beautiful Beacon Hill home with meticulous care. To the world, I appeared the perfect corporate wife, supportive, elegant, and entirely dependent on my husband's success. What Richard never knew, what I'd kept carefully hidden through 3.5 decades of marriage, was that the Harrison fortune wasn't his creation at all. It was mine. I glanced back at my phone and forwarded the entire message thread to my private email account before taking screenshots. Then I stood, brushed the garden soil from my slacks, and walked with measured steps to my study. The room was the one space in our home that was truly mine, with its antique mahogany desk that had belonged to my grandmother. I unlocked the bottom drawer and removed a leather-bound journal, one of many that documented the slow dissolution of my marriage. April 18th, I wrote, my handwriting precise and steady. Received photographic confirmation of affair with Melissa. Location: Martha's Vineyard house. Evidence secured and forwarded to private account. Below, I added the latest entry to my ongoing list. Richard claimed Chicago business meeting. Actual location: our vacation home with Mistress. My grandmother Elizabeth had been the daughter of a shipping magnate, widowed young and left to manage an empire in an era when women weren't supposed to understand business. She'd raised me with one clear directive: never place your financial security in a man's hands. On her deathbed, she'd made me promise to protect my inheritance no matter what. Men will see your wealth as theirs to command, she told me, her once strong voice barely a whisper. Never let anyone control what's rightfully yours, Catherine. I'd honored that promise throughout my marriage. While Richard believed he'd built his investment firm from nothing, the truth was that my family's money had provided the initial capital. The company letterhead might read Harrison Financial, but the founding documents bore my signature, not his. Over the years, I'd allowed him to believe his own mythology. The self-made man who'd climbed Boston's social ladder through sheer determination. I picked up my phone and dialed the one person who knew the complete truth. Eleanor Blackwell's office, answered a crisp voice. It's Catherine Harrison for Eleanor. It's urgent. Within moments, my grandmother's former attorney and my most trusted confidant was on the line. Catherine, what's happened? Eleanor was 72 now but sharp as ever, having shepherded 3 generations of my family's financial interests. She sent photos, Eleanor. The Mistress. From our Martha's Vineyard house. A brief silence, then, I see. And they're explicit enough to establish the affair beyond doubt. Beyond any doubt, I confirmed, my voice steady. He told me he was in Chicago for a banking conference. This changes our timeline, Eleanor said. I could hear her opening files on her desk. We've been transferring assets gradually to avoid raising red flags, but with documented infidelity, we can accelerate the process. For the past 5 years, Eleanor had been helping me quietly reclaim complete control of my assets. Property deeds had been updated, ownership percentages in the company adjusted, and investments moved to accounts in my name alone. We'd proceeded cautiously, making changes that appeared routine, keeping Richard distracted with the trappings of success while the actual foundation of that success shifted beneath his feet. What do you need me to do? I asked. Nothing yet. Continue as normal. I'll file the preliminary divorce papers but keep them sealed. When did you say Richard is due back from his Chicago trip? Sunday evening. Perfect. That gives us 3 days. Can you access his office computer? I smiled slightly. I've had his passwords for years. He's never bothered to change them. Good. We need the recent client acquisition documents. I suspect he's been moving company funds to establish accounts for his new friend. After ending the call, I walked to our bedroom and stood before the full-length mirror. At 58, I was still attractive. My dark hair now threaded with silver laugh lines framing eyes that had seen through Richard's facade for longer than I cared to admit. I'd maintained the appearance of the perfect wife while building my invisible empire right under his nose. I picked up a framed photo from our dresser. Richard and me on our 30th anniversary, his arm possessively around my waist, both of us smiling. The perfect Boston power couple. Time to drop the act, I told my reflection, setting the photo face down. I turned to my closet and selected a simple black dress. Elegant, expensive, understated. Eleanor and I had an empire to protect, and the first strike had just been delivered by an unwitting messenger named Melissa, who had no idea she'd just handed me the key to my freedom. After setting the photo frame face down, I moved to my home office and unlocked the hidden compartment behind my collection of first-edition Jane Austen novels. Inside lay a sleek black ledger. Physical evidence I maintained despite our digital age. Some things were too important to trust entirely to computers. The ledger contained a decade of meticulous documentation. Account numbers, property deeds, transfer dates, and ownership percentages. Each entry represented a carefully calculated move in the long game I'd been playing. I ran my finger down the most recent page, noting the Martha's Vineyard property that featured so prominently in Melissa's taunting photos. Richard had surprised me with that vacation home for our 30th anniversary. He'd made a grand show of presenting the keys at a party surrounded by our friends, beaming with pride at his generosity. What he didn't know was that I had selected the property months earlier, working through shell companies tied to my grandmother's trust. The deed listed Catherine E. Harrison as sole owner, but Richard had never bothered to examine the paperwork closely. He simply assumed his name was there alongside mine. Men like Richard see what they expect to see, Eleanor had told me when we finalized the purchase. His ego won't allow him to question his ownership of something so valuable. She had been right. For 5 years, Richard had hosted business associates at his Martha's Vineyard estate, never once suspecting that he had no legal claim to the property. Now his mistress was lounging on my deck, drinking from my glasses, sleeping in my bed, all while thinking she was staking a claim on Richard's empire. I smiled faintly at the irony. The ledger also detailed the gradual restructuring of Harrison Financial. The company had been built with my inheritance as seed money, though Richard believed a small business loan had launched his career. In the early years, I'd allowed him to maintain operational control while I secured majority ownership through a complex web of trusts and holding companies. 10 years ago, when I found lipstick on his collar for the first time, so cliché it was almost disappointing, I began the process of financial disentanglement. Each quarter, I transferred small percentages of company ownership into my protected trust. Eleanor helped draft the documents that Richard signed without reading. Annual reports, tax filings, organizational restructuring papers. He was always too busy impressing clients to bother with administrative details. By now, Richard's actual ownership of Harrison Financial had dwindled to a mere 12%, though he believed he controlled 70%. His signature remained on company letterhead, his face smiled from the website, but his actual authority had been systematically dismantled. I closed the ledger and retrieved another folder containing photographs of Richard's prized possessions. The Aston Martin he drove to impress clients, purchased through my family's art foundation and registered in my name. The Patek Philippe watch he flaunted at board meetings, a gift from me that remained legally mine. The Monet in his office, the Rodin sculpture in our foyer, the wine collection he showcased to friends, all mine. Richard had always been careless about the details, preferring the appearance of wealth to the responsibility of managing it. This carelessness had made my task easier. While he focused on being seen with the right people at the right clubs, I focused on securing our assets. Or rather, my assets. The phone rang, interrupting my inventory. Richard's name flashed on the screen. I took a breath and answered with the warm, supportive tone I'd perfected over decades. "Hi, darling. How's Chicago?" "Exhausting," he lied smoothly. "Back-to-back meetings with investors. The Taylor account is almost finalized." In the background, I could hear waves, the distinctive rhythm of the Atlantic hitting the shore near our Martha's Vineyard home. I pictured him standing on the deck, perhaps with Melissa nearby, constructing his fiction while living his truth. "Poor dear," I sympathized. "Will you be home Sunday as planned?" "That's why I'm calling," he said, his voice dropping into what he thought was his irresistible register. "The negotiations are taking longer than expected. I might need to stay through Monday." "Of course," I replied. "Whatever you need. The company comes first." "That's my girl," he said, the condescension barely concealed. "Always understanding." After hanging up, I checked the security app on my phone. 5 years ago, I'd had state-of-the-art cameras installed throughout our vacation home, accessible only through my private account. Now, I watched as Richard returned to the deck where Melissa lounged in a bikini, champagne flute in hand. He leaned down to kiss her, gesturing toward the phone with a triumphant smile. I took screenshots, adding them to my growing file of evidence. That evening, I hosted a small dinner party for 3 couples from Richard's executive team. I served his favorite wine, laughed at the right moments, and played the perfect corporate wife. When someone asked about Richard's absence, I repeated his lie about Chicago meetings, noting which executives exchanged knowing glances. They knew. Perhaps they all knew. The thought didn't sting as it once might have. After the guests departed, I sat alone in our formal living room, surrounded by the trappings of our supposedly shared success. The crystal chandelier Richard had insisted on because it made a statement. The custom furniture that complemented his ego. The portrait of us commissioned for our 25th anniversary that hung above the fireplace, portraying us as Boston royalty. In that moment, I made my decision. No more gradual transfers. No more quiet preparation. It was time to accelerate my plan. I texted Eleanor, "Move forward with everything. I'm ready." Her response came immediately, "Are you certain? Once we file, there's no turning back." I looked at my reflection in the darkened window, a woman who had spent half her life playing a role created for someone else's comfort. Behind that reflection, I could almost see my grandmother's approving smile. "Yes," I replied. "It's time Richard learned who truly owns the kingdom he thinks is his." The morning after my decision to accelerate the divorce proceedings, I woke with renewed purpose. Before confronting Richard, I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with. Not just my husband, but the woman who thought she was replacing me. Over breakfast, I opened my laptop and began my research into Melissa Daniels. LinkedIn revealed she was indeed 34. A marketing executive who had joined Harrison Financial just 18 months ago. Her profile boasted an MBA from Wharton and a carefully curated list of accomplishments. What interested me more were the gaps. The companies she'd left off her work history, the connections she'd hidden. I had access to the company's HR files through backdoor channels Eleanor had established years ago. Melissa's employment application listed her previous position at Weston Partners, another financial firm in Boston. The contact person there was someone I knew from charity work. Margaret Wilson, head of human resources. I called Margaret under the pretense of planning a fundraiser. "Catherine, how lovely to hear from you," Margaret greeted me warmly. "It's been too long." After exchanging pleasantries, I carefully steered the conversation. "I'm putting together a committee for the Children's Hospital benefit. I was considering asking one of Richard's new executives, Melissa Daniels? I believe she worked with you at Weston Partners." Margaret's pause spoke volumes. "Melissa Daniels. Yes, she was with us briefly. I wouldn't recommend her for committee work. She tends to be focused on her own advancement." "Oh, that's disappointing to hear." "Between us," Margaret lowered her voice, "she left under difficult circumstances. There was a situation with one of our senior partners. His marriage didn't survive it. By the end of our call, I had what I needed. Melissa had a history of relationships with married executives, using them as stepping stones in her career. Weston Partners wasn't on her resume because she'd been quietly asked to leave after the scandal. Later that day, while reviewing company emails through Richard's account, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Richard had drafted a proposal for a new international division of Harrison Financial, with Melissa slated as its director. The division would control nearly 40% of the company's assets, including offices in London and Singapore that I had personally secured through my family connections. My husband was planning to hand a significant portion of my company to his mistress. The draft proposal was scheduled for board presentation next month. Richard had already started lobbying key board members, most of whom owed their positions to him and would likely approve without question. What Richard didn't realize was that I had final approval rights on any structural changes, a clause Eleanor had inserted into the company bylaws during a restructuring 5 years ago. He had signed the documents without reading them, too busy entertaining clients on his latest golf trip. I forwarded the proposal to Eleanor with a simple note. "See what they're planning." Her response was immediate. "This accelerates our timeline. We need to move before this reaches the board." That weekend, while Richard believed I was visiting my college roommate in New York, I drove to Martha's Vineyard. I parked my car a mile from our vacation home and approached on foot through the wooded path that bordered the property. The security system recognized my phone and disarmed automatically without alerting other users. From the guest house, I had a clear view of the main residence. Richard and Melissa spent the day on the deck, drinking, laughing, planning their future. My future. I used a telephoto lens to document their presence, capturing images of Richard showing Melissa blueprints that I recognized as the London office expansion plans. That evening, as they dressed for dinner, I slipped into the main house while they showered. I placed small recording devices in Richard's office and the living room, legal in Massachusetts as I was an owner of the property. Then I returned to my hiding place in the guest house. When they left for dinner, I entered the main house again and accessed Richard's laptop. His password was still my birthday, a detail that now seemed insulting rather than sentimental. I downloaded his recent emails, including exchanges with board members about Melissa's promotion and private messages between them discussing their future together. In one email, Richard had written, "Once the new division is established, we'll have everything we need. Catherine won't suspect anything until it's too late." I photographed the screen, adding it to my evidence file. The next morning, I returned to Boston before they woke, leaving no trace of my presence. 2 days later, Melissa sent a second message to my phone. "Looking forward to redecorating your house, Catherine. Richard says your taste is so outdated. Don't worry, I'll make sure to use the money from your trust fund wisely." She included a photo of herself wearing my grandmother's sapphire necklace, a family heirloom kept in the Martha's Vineyard house safe. A safe that only Richard and I knew the combination to. Instead of responding, I forwarded the message to Eleanor, who replied, "She just handed us written evidence of her knowledge of your financial arrangements. This constitutes conspiracy." Melissa's message contained another critical clue. She mentioned my trust fund, information that wasn't public knowledge. Richard had clearly shared confidential financial details with her, another violation of our prenuptial agreement. That afternoon I made perhaps my boldest move. Through social media, I located and contacted Jennifer Lawson, listed as Melissa's colleague at Weston Partners. A quick background check confirmed my suspicion. Jennifer had once been Melissa's close friend before a falling out around the time Melissa left the firm. We met at a quiet cafe in Cambridge, far from financial district eyes. Jennifer was initially hesitant, but something in my calm demeanor must have reassured her. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "When Richard's wife asked to meet me, I thought you'd be hysterical, vengeful." I smiled slightly. "I just want information." Jennifer's story confirmed my research. Melissa had a pattern. Target married executives become indispensable professionally, then personally, and leverage the relationship for career advancement. At Weston Partners, she'd nearly secured a director position before the affair became public. "She doesn't want the men, not really," Jennifer explained. "She wants what they can give her. Power, position, status. And the wives." Jennifer looked down at her coffee. "Collateral damage. Melissa actually keeps score. How quickly she can replace them." As our meeting concluded, Jennifer hesitated before adding, "She's not as smart as she thinks she is." At Weston, she never realized the wife she was replacing was the chairman's daughter. That's the real reason she was asked to leave. I drove home with a strange sense of calm. Melissa thought she was playing chess, but she didn't realize she'd stepped into a game that began long before she arrived. A game where I had positioned every piece on the board. The day after meeting with Jennifer, I arrived at Eleanor's office building through the private entrance she reserved for high-profile clients. Her corner office overlooked Boston Harbor, the morning sunlight glinting off the water. Eleanor wasn't alone. 4 other attorneys and a forensic accountant sat around her conference table, files spread before them. "Catherine," Eleanor rose to greet me. "I'd like you to meet the team who will help us reclaim your empire." For the next 3 hours, we crafted a strategy that would leave nothing to chance. The forensic accountant, Dr. Sophia Chin, had analyzed every transaction Richard had made over the past 2 years. He's been systematically moving smaller amounts, never enough to trigger automatic notifications, into a holding company called MDG Ventures, Dr. Chin explained, sliding a folder toward me. "MD for Melissa Daniels," I noted. "NG. We believe it stands for Global." The company was incorporated in Delaware 6 months ago, with a subsidiary already established in the Cayman Islands. Eleanor's litigation specialist, James Harmon, outlined our legal approach. "We've prepared injunctions for every property and account. The moment we file, everything freezes. He won't be able to transfer a single penny." By the time I left Eleanor's office, our plan was set. The divorce papers were drafted, injunctions prepared, and a timeline established. We would move in stages. First securing the assets, then revealing Richard's betrayal, and finally reclaiming what was mine in court. "Are you ready for this, Catherine?" Eleanor asked as we walked to the elevator. "Once we start, your life as you've known it will change forever." I thought of the garden I'd so carefully tended, both literally and figuratively, for 35 years. "I've been ready since the day I found the first lipstick stain," I replied. The following Monday, Richard returned from his Chicago trip, tanned from his weekend at Martha's Vineyard. He kissed my cheek absently and retreated to his home office, unaware that I had already begun dismantling his facade. That week, the first cracks appeared in his confidence. He came home from work visibly agitated, loosening his tie with jerky movements. "Something strange happened today," he said over dinner. "The London office lease renewal required my signature, but the management company said I wasn't authorized." I kept my expression neutral, spearing a piece of asparagus. "How odd. Did they say who was authorized?" "Some trust I've never heard of. Probably a clerical error." He poured himself a generous scotch. "I had to have Peterson from legal sort it out." What Richard didn't know was that Peterson couldn't actually sort it out. The lease was held by my family's trust, and I had instructed the management company to decline Richard's signature the week before. "I'm sure it's nothing," I soothed, refilling his glass. "Just bureaucratic nonsense." 3 days later, he encountered another obstacle when trying to approve the budget for Melissa's proposed international division. The board secretary informed him that final approval required a second signature. Mine. A requirement that had always existed in the company bylaws but that Richard had never bothered to read. Richard brought the budget home that evening, sliding it across the kitchen counter while I prepared dinner. Need your signature on this, darling. Just a formality for the new division. I glanced at it, noting Melissa's name prominently featured as division head. Of course. I'll look it over this weekend. It's just standard budget approval, he pressed. The board meeting is tomorrow morning. I set down my knife and turned to face him. I always read what I sign, Richard. You taught me that. The subtle reminder of his own failure to follow this advice hung between us. Richard's irritation was visible, but he couldn't press further without revealing the urgency behind Melissa's appointment. Fine. Monday then. The document would never receive my signature, but Richard wouldn't discover that until it was too late. The following Saturday evening, Richard surprised me by announcing we were hosting a dinner party for key board members. Last-minute thing, he explained casually. Just a few colleagues to discuss the new division. When the doorbell rang at 7, I opened it to find 4 board members, and Melissa Daniels. She wore a black cocktail dress that cost more than most junior executives could afford, her smile faltering slightly when she saw me. Catherine, this is Melissa Daniels, our new marketing director. Richard introduced us smoothly. Melissa, my wife, Catherine. Lovely to meet you, I extended my hand, noting the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. Richard has mentioned your excellent work. Throughout dinner, I played the perfect hostess, pretending not to notice how Richard's hand lingered on Melissa's shoulder or how they exchanged knowing glances across the table. I served my grandmother's famous lobster bisque and discussed Boston's latest charity events as if I hadn't seen them naked in my vacation home. After dessert, Richard led everyone to his study to review the international division plans. I excused myself, claiming a headache, but secretly activated the recording app on Richard's desk computer before leaving, capturing every word of their planning session. The next day, while Richard and Melissa attended a strategy session, according to his calendar, I visited Harrison Financial's offices. As Richard's wife, I had access to the executive floor. His assistant smiled warmly, unaware that I was there for more than the charity committee files I requested. While searching for the files, I accessed Richard's executive computer and downloaded critical financial documents, including evidence of the funds he'd been diverting to MDG Ventures. I also retrieved the original company formation documents bearing my signature from the locked cabinet in his credenza. Documents that would prove crucial in court. The final act began 3 days later. Richard called from the office, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Did you freeze the executive compensation account? He demanded without preamble. I'm not sure what you mean, I replied calmly, though I knew exactly what had happened. Eleanor had initiated the first phase of our plan, restricting Richard's access to the accounts he used to fund his extramarital lifestyle. Don't play dumb, Catherine. I tried to transfer the quarterly bonuses and my access was denied. The bank said the authorization had been changed. How strange, I murmured. Perhaps you should come home so we can discuss it. When Richard stormed through the front door 30 minutes later, his face was flushed with anger. What the hell are you doing? Those accounts are essential for company operations. I sat in my grandmother's armchair, outwardly calm though my heart raced. Are they? Or are they essential for funding Melissa's new wardrobe and your weekends in Martha's Vineyard? His face went blank with shock before quickly hardening. I don't know what you think you know. I know everything, Richard, I interrupted quietly. Every transfer to MDG Ventures. Every weekend away. Every promise you've made to Melissa about the company's future. My company's future. For the first time in our marriage, Richard looked afraid. Richard's face cycled through emotions. Shock, anger, then a practiced calm as he attempted to regain control. You're overreacting to office gossip, Catherine. Melissa is a valuable employee, nothing more. Save your lies for someone who hasn't seen the photos, I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. The divorce papers will be served tomorrow. I suggest you find somewhere else to sleep tonight. That night, as Richard packed a suitcase, making angry phone calls in hushed tones, I notified our household staff that they would report only to me going forward. By morning, Richard had moved into the Four Seasons downtown, using a company credit card that would be deactivated by noon. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Eleanor advised me to maintain my normal routine to avoid tipping our hand further. For 5 days I attended my usual charity committee meetings, garden club luncheons, and even a symphony fundraiser where several board members expressed concern about Richard's absence. I smiled politely and changed the subject, watching them exchange glances. Word was spreading through Boston's financial community. Something was happening at Harrison Financial. Richard had stopped coming to the office, delegating through his executive assistant. Calls to his cell went straight to voicemail. The company's stock dipped slightly as rumors circulated. The morning of the hearing arrived with a spring rainstorm that lashed against the windows of Eleanor's town car as we drove to the courthouse. I wore a simple navy dress and my grandmother's pearls, elegant but understated. No jewelry Richard had given me. Nothing that suggested the wealth at stake. "Are you ready?" Eleanor asked as we pulled up to the courthouse side entrance, away from the main steps where financial reporters had already gathered, somehow alerted to the proceedings. "I've been ready for 35 years, I replied. We entered through a private security entrance and waited in a conference room while Eleanor's team arranged the exhibits, boxes of documents chronicling my ownership and Richard's deception. At precisely 9:30, we walked into courtroom 4B. Richard was already seated with his attorney, Timothy Wells, a corporate lawyer who specialized in mergers rather than divorces, a telling choice that made Eleanor smile slightly. Richard's head jerked up as we entered. His expression shifted from confident smirk to confusion as he took in not just Eleanor but her entire team of 5 attorneys and 2 paralegals. His eyes met mine and for a brief moment, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. Judge Carolyn Marshall entered, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for fairness and an intolerance for wasted time. Harrison versus Harrison, preliminary hearing for asset determination and temporary orders. Counsels, identify yourselves. After introductions, Eleanor rose. Your Honor, we've filed for an emergency asset freeze based on evidence of financial misconduct by the respondent. Timothy Wells objected immediately. Your Honor, this is merely a routine divorce. Mrs. Harrison has no grounds for emergency measures. Judge Marshall glanced at the thick binder Eleanor had provided. I'll determine what's routine, Counselor. Ms. Blackwell, proceed. Eleanor approached the bench with the first exhibit, the original formation documents for Harrison Financial bearing my signature as primary investor and majority shareholder. As she walked back to our table, the courtroom door opened. Melissa Daniels slipped in, wearing a conservative gray suit, clearly expecting to provide moral support for Richard. Our eyes met briefly before she took a seat in the back row. As these documents demonstrate, Eleanor continued, Harrison Financial was established with funds from Mrs. Harrison's family trust. While Mr. Harrison has served as CEO, legal ownership has always resided primarily with Mrs. Harrison. Timothy Wells shot to his feet. Your Honor, my client built this company from nothing. Mrs. Harrison was merely a supportive spouse. A supportive spouse who provided the initial $2 million in capital? Eleanor countered, producing bank transfers from 1988. A supportive spouse whose family connections secured the company's first major clients? A supportive spouse whose name appears on every major asset acquisition. Richard leaned forward, whispering urgently to his attorney, who appeared increasingly flustered as Eleanor methodically presented deed after deed. The Beacon Hill home, the Martha's Vineyard property, the Aspen Ski Lodge, all listing me as the sole or primary owner. Furthermore, Eleanor continued, we have evidence that Mr. Harrison has been diverting company funds to a Delaware corporation called MDG Ventures, established to benefit his mistress, Melissa Daniels. At this, Melissa visibly stiffened in her seat. Richard's head swiveled toward her, his expression thunderous. Judge Marshall examined the financial records. Mr. Wells, did your client establish this MDG Ventures? Wells conferred briefly with Richard. Your Honor, any such entity would be a legitimate business venture of Harrison Financial. A legitimate business venture that happens to share initials with Mr. Harrison's mistress? Eleanor produced the photos Melissa had sent me, carefully edited to maintain decorum while clearly establishing the relationship. These were sent to my client by Ms. Daniels herself, along with written messages indicating her knowledge of Mrs. Harrison's financial holdings. A slight gasp came from the back of the courtroom. Melissa had gone pale, suddenly understanding she was not a spectator but an exhibit. As the hearing progressed, Richard's confidence visibly crumbled. When Eleanor presented evidence that he had attempted to transfer ownership of the London office to MDG Ventures just 2 days earlier, after being served divorce papers, he slumped in his chair. "Your Honor," Eleanor concluded, "given Mr. Harrison's clear intent to dissipate marital assets and his abuse of corporate authority, we ask for an immediate freeze of all accounts and properties pending final determination." Judge Marshall nodded. "I've seen enough. The court grants the temporary freeze on all assets listed in the petition. Mr. Harrison will maintain a living stipend of $5,000 monthly until final judgment. Corporate operations will continue under the interim leadership structure proposed by Mrs. Harrison's counsel." The interim leadership structure, which Richard was seeing for the first time, removed him as CEO and installed our longtime CFO as temporary head. When Richard realized the full implication of the ruling, he turned to me with naked fury. "You can't do this. That company is my life." "No, Richard," I replied softly. "It's mine. It always was." As we rose to leave, I glanced toward Melissa, expecting to see anger or defiance. Instead, she looked lost, the calculating confidence replaced by genuine fear as she confronted a future without the power and position Richard had promised her. Walking past Richard, I felt an unexpected surge of emotion, not triumph or hatred, but a profound sadness for the decades we'd wasted. For a moment, I saw not the man who had betrayed me but the ambitious young financial analyst I'd fallen in love with, now facing the ruins of the life he thought he'd built. "You know what the worst part is, Richard?" I said quietly as I passed. "I would have shared everything with you if you'd just been honest." His face crumpled then, the full weight of his loss finally registering, not just the money or the company, but the partnership he'd never truly valued until it was gone. As I walked out of the courthouse with Eleanor and our legal team, spring sunshine had replaced the morning's rain. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, storms clearing to reveal something fresh and new. Reporters called out questions, but Eleanor guided me to the waiting town car with practiced efficiency. "Phase 1 complete," she said once we were safely inside. "Now we negotiate the final terms." Over the next 6 weeks, Richard's lawyers made increasingly desperate counteroffers. His initial bravado, demands for half the company and properties, gave way to pleas for a fair settlement, as his financial reality set in. The Four Seasons had asked him to leave when his company credit cards were declined. He'd moved into a furnished apartment in Back Bay, the rent paid by a former colleague who still hoped to curry favor. The final settlement conference took place in Eleanor's conference room rather than the courthouse. Richard arrived looking thinner, the confident swagger replaced by a wary exhaustion. "Catherine," he nodded stiffly. I studied the man I'd spent most of my adult life with and felt a curious detachment. "Richard." The negotiations lasted 7 hours. By the end, Richard had accepted terms that would have been unimaginable to him 2 months earlier. He would retain a 5% stake in Harrison Financial, now officially renamed Elizabeth Trust Holdings after my grandmother, with no management authority. He would receive a modest monthly stipend for 5 years, provided he signed a non-competition agreement and relinquished all claims to our properties. Most significantly, I had included an unexpected provision. Richard would establish a scholarship for women in finance at Wellesley College, funded from his remaining company shares. It would be named for my grandmother, ensuring her legacy would touch young women's lives long after we were gone. When Richard signed the final documents, there was a moment of shared recognition between us, acknowledgement that an era had ended. Not with dramatic accusations or tearful goodbyes, but with the quiet scratch of a pen on legal paper. "I underestimated you," he said finally. "All these years." "Yes," I replied simply. "You did." 2 weeks after the settlement, I called my first executive board meeting as CEO of Elizabeth Trust Holdings. The boardroom fell silent as I entered. Many of these men had known me for decades only as Richard's wife, the gracious hostess of charity galas and holiday parties. "Gentlemen," I addressed them, taking the chair at the head of the table that had been Richard's for 30 years. "We have significant changes to discuss. By meeting's end, 3 board members had resigned, those most closely aligned with Richard's leadership. I appointed 2 women and an international finance expert to replace them. The company's organizational chart was restructured, eliminating the proposed international division that would have been Melissa's domain and instead creating a more equitable distribution of authority among existing directors. Some of you may be wondering if I have the experience to lead this company, I said as the meeting concluded. Let me assure you, I've been leading it from the shadows for years. The only difference is that now you can see me. The transition generated expected turbulence. 2 major clients temporarily withdrew their accounts, concerned about stability under new leadership. But when our first quarterly results showed a 12% increase in portfolio performance, largely from unwinding Richard's riskier investments, the clients returned, bringing others with them. One evening in early autumn, I decided to dine alone at Maison Laurent, the French restaurant where Richard and I had celebrated our anniversaries. The maitre d' looked momentarily confused when I arrived without Richard but quickly recovered, showing me to our usual table by the window. Just water for now, Pierre, I told him, settling into my seat. I'll look at the wine list myself this evening. As I studied the menu, familiar voices approached. Barbara and William Cavendish, longtime friends who had attended our dinner parties for years, paused at my table. Catherine, dining alone. Barbara's voice carried a note of concern tinged with curiosity. Yes, I smiled. I'm enjoying my own company these days. We've heard about the changes, William said awkwardly. If you need anything. Actually, I interrupted gently, what I need is good conversation over an excellent meal. Would you care to join me? Their surprise at my invitation was evident, but they accepted. Throughout dinner I watched their perception of me shift. Barbara, who had always directed her substantive comments to Richard, listened with growing interest as I discussed the company's new direction. William, initially speaking to me with careful sympathy, ended the evening asking my advice about a potential investment. You're different, Barbara observed as we waited for our cars. More present somehow. Not different, I corrected her. Just no longer invisible. The most unexpected development came the following week when Richard's sister Margaret called, asking to meet for tea. We had always been cordial but never close. She arrived at my home punctually, elegant as always in understated cashmere. After exchanging pleasantries, Margaret placed her teacup down with deliberate care. I need to apologize to you, Catherine. For what? For knowing about Richard's indiscretions over the years and saying nothing. Her gaze was direct, unflinching. The first was Angela, his assistant in the 90s. Then Rebecca from the London office. There were others. I wasn't surprised by the revelation of additional affairs, but her awareness of them was unexpected. Why tell me now? Because I enabled him by staying silent. And because I admire what you've done. Not just the divorce but how you've handled everything afterward. With dignity. She hesitated. Richard was always our parents' favorite. The son who could do no wrong. I watched them excuse his behavior from childhood, teaching him there would never be consequences. Our conversation lasted hours, spanning decades of family dynamics I'd never fully understood. Margaret shared insights about Richard that helped complete the puzzle of our marriage. By evening's end, we had established the foundation of a friendship based on shared understanding rather than shared history. I'd like to invest in your company, Margaret said as she was leaving. Not because it's Richard's, but because I believe in your leadership. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, life had settled into new patterns. I divided my time between company leadership and personal passions I'd set aside years ago, studying art history, traveling to museums across Europe, cultivating my garden with experimental roses. The company thrived under my visible guidance, and I discovered I enjoyed the challenges of direct leadership more than I'd expected. Then, on a crisp October morning, my assistant handed me an envelope with an unfamiliar Los Angeles postmark. Inside was a letter from Melissa Daniels. I held it for a long moment, weighing my options. Reading it might reopen wounds that had finally healed. Ignoring it would be the easiest choice. I glanced at my grandmother's portrait on my office wall, remembering her strength, her wisdom, her uncompromising independence. With steady hands I made my decision.